The Winter Tree by Georgina Lewis. Read by Jill Greenacre. Chapter 3. The Jackdaw. Hester appeared to settle into our household with very little trouble. She shared our bedroom and my clothes and came with Lissy and Perrin and me to the little stone school in the nearest village, there being no school in Lyubov itself. And soon it seemed there had always been 5 children in our family. After a bit of initial teasing from the other children at school about her extraordinary lack of basic learning and her terrible spelling, Hester was more or less ignored. Once or twice Veronica Braze pulled her long red plaits and other children pinched her neck and tried to make her cry, but they never succeeded, and after a while they lost interest. Hester rarely cried. A remote, closed look would come over her face, and then they would leave her alone. In many ways she seemed years older than me. I found her a strange girl, sad, as if she was steeped in sorrow through to her bones and could never quite be free of it. At times there was a poor lost look in her eyes, a slight enchantment, as if she were forever listening to music just out of our reach. She was destined to be small, and she stayed slight, although her shape filled out a bit with Mother's good food. Sometimes she sparkled and laughed and had a bit of fun with us, but always there was that odd, pinched look deep at the back of her eyes. I could never get Mother or Father to reveal the circumstances of her birth. She was the only child of Father's younger sister, which made her our cousin, and she had the same surname as us, so I suppose she must have been a love child. Although we had almost no contact at all with Father's family, who thought us children wild and Father more than a little eccentric, there had never been any hesitation about who would take Hester in when her mother died. Her father was an even more shadowy figure, and I could never get anyone to talk about him at all. Whenever asked by the children at school, Hester would simply say, "He died," and go all quiet, in that shut-in way of hers, and you could get no more out of her. Perhaps she knew no more than we did. Lissy and I used to imagine things about him and make up stories. Lissy thought he might have been a gypsy. There were gypsies up on the hill from time to time, and we were always hoping they might turn out to be Hester's relatives. But we never really knew. I don't think Mother did either. Father knew, but he would never say. He would just begin to clear his throat with that little dry embarrassed cough of his and go outside to pull rhubarb or tune his violin or potter about in the pantry with his wine jars. About this time he had begun to make the odd gallon or 2 of wine with fruit and vegetables from the garden, and the huge jars of it stood for months around the pantry shelves. As children, the pantry was a magical place to us, with rows of these huge fermenting jars, red and yellow and straw-coloured, with half-stained labels in Father's crabbed handwriting stuck on their sides, and all of them bubbling and gulping and giving off gusts of mysterious vapour as the yeasts went about their alchemy. Lissy kept well away, for the smell alone would set her off sneezing, as she often did for weeks during the summer. But Perrin and Hester and I loved it in there. For a treat, we were sometimes allowed to watch Father at work among the jars, sieving and straining and racking the wines with a huge long pipe and a giant funnel. We had to stand well back with our hands well washed and not make a sound while he worked, but sometimes, on our birthdays and on Christmas Eve, we might be allowed a watered sip. As we grew older, we were occasionally allowed to go up into the tower with Father when he went to ring for the service at church. We climbed the spiral steps behind him, careful not to get our fingers in the way of his enormous shoes, until we reached the ringing room. There we sat on benches round the walls, watching with awe as the ringers took their places and pulled away in some mysterious sequence they alone seemed to understand. The ropes flickered up and down, seemingly alive in their hands, and the ringers nodded and frowned at each other within the dancing ropes. Harry Tregulla or George Pascoe would shout out strange words that meant nothing to us, and they would all mutter to themselves, their lips moving silently, as if they counted something that we had no knowledge of. Occasionally father would shout, "Stand!" in great irritation and glower at some unfortunate member of the circle and proceed to berate him with peculiar arguments and talk of bobs and dodgers and things called snap leads, as if they'd been taking dogs for a walk instead of making music. But always we had to sit there silently and not move a muscle if we could help it, and certainly not to walk about. It all seemed a curious occupation to me, but father's eyes sparkled and gleamed with apparently intense concentration, and after what had appeared to be a bit of music that pleased him greatly, would come over to us and be quite jovial, winking at Perrin and promising to teach him one day when he was tall enough to reach the ropes properly. "What about us, father?" Lissy and I tentatively inquired. "Can we learn too one day?" And father threw back his head and laughed heartily, but the vicar looked faintly disapproving, as if such laughter was slightly out of place within the hallowed walls. There were boards yellow with age around the ringing chamber, and lists of names and numbers under esoteric titles like Bob Minor and Doubles, and one that I always thought said Grandsires Triplets, until Perrin put me right years afterwards. Looking back, I suppose we were very lucky children. We had plenty of freedom and ran wild about the village and the heath behind, and we almost lived in a churchyard. The place was mostly deserted anyway, and full of high old elm trees which waved their branches in the blue vault overhead when the wind blew from the hill. They were a nesting place for rooks for miles around, and in spring the air was full of their clamour and the old graves littered with dropped twigs. Hester was fascinated by the churchyard and by the birds. Whenever she was missing from home, I always knew I would find her sitting under the elms up there, with the poor mangy bird beside her in its cage, shrieking and squawking and hopping about on its perch as the rooks in the trees called to it and taunted it with their freedom. Hester would sit there for hours, transfixed by the birds, and I think desperately fighting with herself to let the jackdaw out to join them. "Let him out then, Hester," Perrin would urge. "Give poor old Jackie a bit of freedom." I can't," cried poor Hester. "They'd peck into bits if I did, but oh dear, I wish I could." "Then don't bring him up here," I would say helplessly. "It only seems to upset him." "No," said Hester passionately. "He do love to watch them flying round and round. Look at him, Abby, all excited and hopping about. He dearly loves to watch them." And indeed the old bird did exhibit great signs of emotion within the cage. It squawked and flapped and ran up and down the perch in great agitation, until Hester called urgently, "Jackie, Jackie, it's me, hush now." And it would crouch low on its legs and peer at her with its one good eye, while the lid came up on the milky one and half closed it, and the poor thing gave up longing. "Oh, I wish I could let him go, I wish I could," said poor Hester, caught in the ancient battle between freedom and security. "But they'd kill poor Jackie up there, they would. They'd tear him to bits." Because of the fleas, Mother made it live outside in its cage and made Hester keep it in the outhouse where we stored the apples on the high racks, well away from the floor, along with the rake and the hoe and numerous rusting bits and pieces, where it was nearly always dark except for a chink of light through a dingy window. Hester would go into it every morning with little parcels of food, and every evening she would take the bird out in the cage for a walk. She fed it on berries and bits of bacon rind and poked worms and snails in through the bars of the cage for it to peck at, and gave it little trays of water to drink. Perrin was greatly intrigued. "Was the bird your mother's, Hester?" "No, Jackie's mine." "But where did he come from?" "I found him in our old garden, and a lady give me the cage." "Why don't he talk, Hester? Can't you teach him to talk? How'd he get that funny eye?" "Cat gotten in the garden." Perrin would make noises of affection and try to persuade it to walk onto his hand inside the cage, but the bird would crouch, considering, then peck irritably at his fingers. "Let him out, Hester," Perrin would plead. "He don't like it in there." "But I can't," wailed Hester. "The others would kill him if I did. Oh, I wish I could, but I can't." We spent long summer evenings in the churchyard, sitting on the lichen-encrusted box tombs with Jackie in his cage beside us, swinging our legs and picking absently at the mossy lumps under our fingers. We would line up bits of it along the top of a tomb to make hedges and fields for woodlice racing. We called them grammar sows and never knew the proper name for them until we went to school. Perrin would arrange several of them into a line of little grey balls, and we would wait breathlessly to see which one would unwind first. After a while, they would hesitantly unfold themselves and start to wander about the mossy enclosures, going round and round the boundaries with the feelers waving in frustration, unaware of the fact that the winners would be poked into the cage for Jackie's critical appraisal. Hester would crouch over them, her face absorbed, and Perrin would prod his with a stick, which Hester said was cheating, and Lissy would cry a bit and hang back, unsure of the ethics of it all. Even at 7, her sense of motherhood was very strong. It was a constant source of sorrow to Hester that she had no relatives of her own buried in the churchyard. She would poke about for hours among the headstones, trying to read the worn inscriptions, hoping to find our name there somewhere, while Jackie sat on his perch in the cage beside her and screeched at the sky, and Perrin and Lissy and I played hide-and-seek among the graves. It never occurred to us that our games were in any way irreverent. I think we felt more awe among the tombs than ever we did in the church. For here, where no adult had set foot for years, were purlieus mystic with unfolding life, of hedges riotous with blossom, the abode of robin and of wren, and if you crouched down very small and pushed your nose into the grasses, you could hear insect music and smell the black earth roar with rain. One afternoon I found Hester kneeling on soft earth and scratching at an ancient stone. "Look, Abby," she said eagerly. "This one could be mine, couldn't it? It could be my grandfather." I peered closely at the name. "No, Hester, it isn't. I'm afraid it's the wrong name." "No, but Abby," she persisted, "it could be mine, couldn't it? I could have it for mine." She leant forward on her knees, a finger tracing the weathered lettering, and slowly read out, "Isaac Bartholomew, dearly beloved husband of Agnes, departed this life, resteth in the arms of the Lord." She paused. "I never had a grandfather." I laughed. "Of course you did, Hester. Everybody has one. Well, 2, your mother's and your father's father." She shook her head firmly. "No, I never had one." "Not one you knew, perhaps, but Hester, your grandpa would have been the same as mine. We're cousins." But she remained unconvinced and stubbornly repeated, "No, I never had a grandfather. I'll have this one." And from then on, every week, winter and summer, she would go up to the churchyard and put a few straggling flower heads on the grave of Isaac Bartholomew. It became a weekly ritual for her, and she never missed. At home, she would go round the garden or the orchard, picking anything suitable that she could find. I would find her in the orchard, head aglow, knee-deep in waving couch grass or sorrel in summer, and in the spring among the daffodils which bloomed and nodded in their thousands. Perrin and I made up an elaborate story for her about Isaac Bartholomew. We gave him wild red hair, like Hester's, a fine flowing beard, flashing eyes, and a parrot. We made him a sailor who had sailed around the West Indies on a pirate ship, found buried treasure, and then come home to claim his bride, Agnes. He then made his fortune mining up on the hills in the local tin mines and produced the vast red-headed family, of whom the only surviving member was Hester. He was a remarkably fine singer, rang the tenor bell to 100 full peals, this was Perrin's contribution, and had a fine reputation for holding his liquor and roistering, whatever that meant. He was deeply appreciative of Hester's continuing to honour his memory with regular bunches of flowers, and in return kept a residential eye on the churchyard for us in our absence. Privately, I thought it not unlikely that Isaac Bartholomew had been a weedy little farmhand with greasy hair and a cast in one eye, but imagination knew no bounds. Unfortunately, Perrin's devotion turned to scorn after a while. "Veronica Braze thinks it's stupid," he said sulkily, kicking the headstone. "Then Veronica's stupid," retorted Hester. "He's my grandfather anyway, not hers. She's only jealous." "He's not. He's only pretend." He's not, Hester would storm and break into anguish wailing. "He's real, and if you don't believe me, you can read it on the stone. Look, it says, Isaac Bartholomew, dearly beloved husband of Agnes, departed this life." "Yes, but he wasn't your grandfather, was he?" said Perrin with laboured emphasis. "He was somebody else's grandfather, not yours." "Whose then?" demanded Hester. "Tell me whose. You don't know, do you? You can't say because you don't know, so there." Then she would toss her head and stamp off down the path between the graves. "You can get your own grandfather's grave. You're not sharing mine." And she would poke little bits of plantain and clover into a jam jar with fierce proprietorial emphasis. But she wouldn't cry. Hester rarely cried. I used to think sometimes it might have helped ease that strange, lost look of hers if she had cried a bit now and then. But in all the time I knew her, I only really ever saw her cry the once. Jackie always accompanied us to the churchyard, scaly feet clutching at his swinging perch as we marched up the lane. Hester would talk softly to him as we walked, or stand the cage on a tomb as we played and let him flap his wings at the sky. Perrin never gave up pleading with her to let him out. "Go on, Hester, I want to see him fly. Let him out, go on." "No," said Hester suddenly, "I can't." "He'd like it up there, Jackie would. Go on, let him go, just for a little bit. You can always put him back in again." And when this failed, he turned to taunting. "You're a cruel girl, Hester, horrid. Veronica Braze says it's cruel to keep a bird in a cage. You're cruel." "Oh, Perrin, she's not," I said angrily. "She can't let him out. He wouldn't come back." "She's cruel, she is," retorted Perrin. "She wouldn't keep him in there if she wasn't cruel." "Oh, I wish I could let him go," wailed poor Hester yet again. "I wish I could, but I can't." And then, quite suddenly one day, she did. She and Perrin and I were taking Jackie up to the old hill for one of his constitutionals on a day that Hester said was his birthday. As we drew near the churchyard, Jackie heard the rooks calling and began to hop about as usual, screeching at the sky. Quite suddenly, Hester made up her mind. She took the cage into the graveyard and stood it on an old box tomb and opened the rusting metal door. Jackie stared at the sudden gap in the bars for a while with frank disbelief, hopped along the perch a few tentative inches, backed away again and stopped. Then, with a scurried flutter and a whirl of fallen feathers, he was out of the cage and off into the blue air. Rooks called above us from their lofty perches, and we stood with our mouths open, enthralled, watching him go. "Happy birthday, Jackie," Perrin called gleefully. "Have a nice time." "Goodbye, Jackie," I called after him. "Goodbye." But Hester said nothing. She just stood there with a look of quiet rapture on her face, watching the bird surge skywards. 3 days later, Perrin and I found a dead jackdaw with a clouded eye in a battered heap on the grass under the tower. It was crawling with fleas, and we buried it in an old cardboard box in a corner of the churchyard field. "We won't tell her," said Perrin soberly. "I expect she'd be upset." We never did.